Thank you. Here, I don't know how to command a room. Thank you all for coming and putting up with a little bit of technical difficulties as always. So I wanted to just really quickly introduce, Ken will be introducing our speaker. I will just really quickly say that I'm really excited that we're having our first speaker to kick off Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Month, Heritage Month. So thank you for everybody for being a part of this. I also want to provide a land acknowledgement. I don't know how to work that. Oh, here we go. Okay. So before we start, the Field Museum acknowledges that it resides within the traditional homelands of the Ho-Chunk, Otoe, Missouri, Iowas, the Menominee, Meskwaki, Sauk, Miami, Wea, Piankashaw, Kickapoo, Illini Confederacy, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. The museum is grateful to the original peoples who laid the foundation for the city of Chicago and for the diverse indigenous nations that reside in Chicago today. So thank you all, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you very much. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Professor Zhe Xi Luo from the University of Chicago, my good friend and very frequent collaborator. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of Luo's academic background, he did his undergrad at Nanjing University, and I realized today that he graduated from there when I was 6 years old. And I didn't realize that the disparity in our ages was quite that much, but it was kind of a funny realization. So hopefully I'm not dating you too much, but so he has an extensive academic career. So one of the things that we share is that we're both alumni at UC Berkeley. We did our PhDs at the University of California Museum of Paleontology. Luo worked extensively with Bill Clemens, who's a famous Mesozoic mammalian paleontologist, if you don't know him, and he was also on my dissertation committee, so some shared history there. After graduating from Berkeley, Luo did a postdoc at Harvard with Buzz Crompton, and then his first faculty position was at the College of Charleston, and from there he moved on to the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh, where he was a curator and also associate director for a while before joining the University of Chicago in about 2012. And in addition to his research accomplishments, some of which we'll be hearing about today, Luo has really been a good collaborator with the museum and contributor to the museum during the time that he has been in the Chicago community. So as many of you know, he's been a participant in some of our recent curatorial search committees, and has been a really excellent resource for that. But in addition to that, he's the head of the Paleo CT lab on campus. And literally thousands of our specimens now across the museum have been scanned using his CT scanner. And so it's a resource that we're really grateful for and a service that we're really pleased to provide. And hopefully our collaborations between your lab and the museum will continue. So, Luo, I'll turn things over to you.
I'm happy to come back to my second home. And I'm in this room so often, and it's just feel very interesting now. First time for a while, I'm up here in the podium instead of there as a comedian. Okay, I really appreciate that this great honor for me to give yet another talk. The content may be familiar to some of you, but I will try my best to give the latest. But it is indeed a big honor because I use the museum's resources very extensively, foremost with Ken, with Bill, and also with Bruce Patterson, Larry, and Adam Ferguson. And I harass you with so many emails about so many collections, and I start to lose track. And, but it's especially a big honor for me to be here in honor of Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Okay, and Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders are always a big presence in STEM fields. But for our fair share, and I want to give a shout out to the 3 Asian American paleobiologists. And I had the great pleasure working with Kiko Shinya, some of the best preparation on the fossil that I desperately need to work with is done by her. And since Jimmy O'Connor came on board, the whole paleobiology scene, the level of activity is basically one notch up, not just for Field Museum, but for the whole Chicago Metro. And we're welcoming Artie Mann to be joining us a little bit later, and very much looking forward to this renewed activity on Mason Creek and this very important research on tetrapods and early ammonits. Okay. Many of the fossil discovery in fossil mammals have really caught the public's attention. Some of them made glossy journals, and some of them made media. Okay. But all this discovery got to be placed in evolutionary biology context. Otherwise, it's just a fossil or a piece of rock, right? The context that I hope to portray today is the ecological evolution of early mammals in the Mesozoic time. Foremost, I'm going to do a briefing on what constitute the ecomorphotype in Jurassic and early Cretaceous. And my main theme is really that this ecomorphotype had iterated, repeated evolution from different mammalian clades in different time. As consequence of those, the same, look the same ecological assemblage of mammals are actually made and then remade multiple times. Okay, and this has something to do with a historical conceptual debate and what is the role of broader contingency when you really map broad geological time scale and enormous spans of diversity, or should deterministic interpretation about evolutionary pattern play a role in our understanding of mammalian macroevolution, okay? And if we look at this replicated evolution of ecological pattern, we are literally not talking about 220 million years of history, and we're talking about 220 million years of reinvented history by different group of mammals. That history have a reasonably stable outline, and that is the extant marsupials and placentals started about 160 million years or so. And then if we trace further to the entire crown group of mammals, that goes perhaps to about 170 million if you date by fossil record. Of course, molecular time estimate will go even further. And there are fossil forms that's closely related to extant mammals, but have not yet acquired all of the features of mammals. And these are what we call the mammalia forms, following Tim Rowe's terminology. The fossil record of that goes back to about 220. And when we conventionally say mammals have 220 million years of evolutionary history coeval with the origin of dinosaurs, we're talking about more or less this geological milestone, okay? And the mammalia forms is nested inside another more inclusive group called Prorostodon or Mammalia morph. And these have even further phylogenetic clades associated. This record goes back to about 230 million. And then if we go further to a landmark, that's the origin of Cynodon. And that's even more inclusive clade of our relatives. And it goes back to beginning of the Triassic or shorter before Permian Triassic transition, okay? And of course, our whole group, the synapsid clade goes back to about 310 million. And essentially this nested hierarchy based purely on morphological inference about the phylogenetic relationship have a reasonable concordance with the geological time that's stable enough of a framework for us to do business, right? So our general approach to understand evolution is we kind of take an exemplary fossil and we compare it to the modern taxon, and we want to understand how the process has changed in this intermediate span and what are the interesting features for us to look at. And this broader evolutionary pattern also has a time signature. And next, I'm going to present the same general phylogeny, but mapped in a time sequence. Okay, and about just before Permian-Triassic extinction, we have the rise of a cynodon, our nearest relative in the synapsid clade. Okay, and then around 230 to 220 million years, up to about 190 million years, we got a whole bunch of new clades that comes in that has the basic fundamental mammalian osteological diagnosis. And these are what we call the mammalia forms. Depends on how you split. There may be 5, 6, 7 different clades. And this stem mammalia form later gave rise to the crown group, which is defined by monotremes and the monotherians, okay? And this origination is right around Middle Jurassic. That's as if we date by fossil, but for molecular phylogeny, it goes a little further. And then comes the very interesting late Jurassic time. And during the late Jurassic, we have several new clades that come into existence, but these are lesser level of phylogenetic rank, but nonetheless, ecologically, they're extremely interesting. 5 or 6 new clades. And by the time we pass the Jurassic and the Cretaceous transition, we're dealing with early Cretaceous. We got a bunch of new clades coming in, but these are literally the subgroups of either multituberculates, monotremes, eutherians. They are already well and deeply nested inside of mammalian crown. So they are interesting as a species by themselves, but they belong to a different phylogenetic rank if you map the whole phylogeny. And if we go to late Cretaceous, the game is largely over from my perspective. All right, and so I'm going to present 2 snapshots, and I'm going to talk about ecological pattern or ecomorphological assembly evolutionary pattern from the middle to late Jurassic. And then I'm going to compare it to the early Cretaceous, primarily because we have the best fossil records of skeletal fossil from mid to late Jurassic and early Cretaceous. Okay, I want to really talk about another more important conceptual issue. Okay, and Stephen Jay Gould is always a great hero of mine. And when I was a postdoc, I saw him distant in the hallway, but he is always busy, and we never have the courage to even bother Steve. But I did have a very decent meeting with Steve Gould, actually together with Neil Shooting when we were both students. And Steve Gould has a very strong advocacy, and that is macroevolution really got its own property. And a very big important part about macroevolution is it has all these very unpredictable contingencies if you look at it from a microevolutionary perspective. And it has this very analog or a metaphor, and that is you rewind and replay the tape of evolution, you may not end up in the same place. Of course, Steve Gould met quite a bit of resistance, and some of the argument he developed on the basis of a Burgess shell tend to be phylogenetically incorrect. But that's a smaller issue, but on a larger issue about contingency versus determinism have stayed with us, and especially in the light of a newer generation of research, as exemplified by some of Jonathan Lozo's work, which, this paper come out in Science in 1998, really restarted the whole game. And Lossos later, just about 3 years ago, wrote a book that re-summarized this discussion for the lay public, but also adding on many, many, many more examples from experimental evolution, so on and so forth. And the point Lossos is making is really, there are regularities, there are repetitive patterns that you can interpret in a deterministic fashion. And there goes this unresolvable philosophical issue, the pendulum always swings back and forth. And in the end, I want to bring the broader discussion about macro evolutionary pattern from Mesozoic mammal in the context of this conceptual framework. The contingency versus determinism evolution have plenty of examples. Okay, here with Zhendong from Beijing Capital Normal University and the Conrad Labanderas collaboration have dug out many of these fossil examples. For here, we have a Jurassic extinct lacewing, and it has this beautiful eye spot on the wing that's analogous to the Cenozoic butterflies. And there are also repeated evolutionary pattern about promises to sample soft tissue and juice of the plants. And so much so that Zhendong titled his book called The Rhythms of Insect Evolution from Jurassic and Cretaceous, right? Okay, and so this issue has general implications. But before we go further, I want to acknowledge the main intellectual contributors of my project. And Chen Meng was a student from Nanjing University, associated with me since he was an undergraduate student. And David Gross-Nichols been working with Ken and me for a good 4.5 years before he moved on with his postdoc. And we have a UChicago undergrad, Spencer Pivetsner, and used extensively the Field Museum marsupial skeletal collection, developed his thesis. And of course, Kiko Shinya, sorry he's not here, and I want to put her on the spot, and many of the best fossil preparation that I benefited from are from her. And of course, April Neander, who provided all this CT scan and the rendering. And we have lots of contributors from various fossil owning institutions, but on this spot, I want to repeat, I want to re-emphasize, I really appreciated this collaboration or broad access of the museum resources from geology, from mammals, and from birds. And John Bass and I had a joint NSF project together, okay? And now the proper theme of my talk, okay? I want to borrow this exhibit diagram from American Museum of Natural History from 1930s to illustrate the point about what we intuitively, empirically recognize as ecomorphotypes, okay? And for example, you can have terrestrial insectivores, you can have terrestrial herbivores by combination of locomotor pattern, but a discriminant between feeding adaptation. These are distinct ecomorphotypes. And we have scansorial climbing mammals, and you can be insectivores being a climber, or you can be also a herbivore that is also a climber. And once you get on the tree, you can become fully arboreal. And once you live on the tree long enough, and you are just one jump away to be a glider or even a power flyer. Okay, essentially, glider and the power flyers are always nested in the scansorial or arboreal mammal ancestry. And then we have fossorial adaptations, and then we have very interesting adaptation about cursorial ungulates. And then we have this cursorial ungulates get big enough, heavy enough, they become graviportal. And then we have tongue feeders that always specialize in addition to their feeding apparatus with some very unique locomotor patterns. And then we have carnivores subdivided either by predators or scavengers each got their own specialization. And then we have semi-aquatic swimmers from multiple clades. And then we have full aquatic swimmers from manatees and the cetaceans. And these are, broadly speaking, just broad categories of recognized ecomorphotype since 200 years ago, 150 years ago. Okay, essentially, the mammalian orders are established originally according to this major ecomorphotypes by natural historian without any aid of genetic data. But these have been now all validated, minus one category insectivora mammals. And each of this ecomorphotype is actually a distinct evolutionary clade. So this ecomorphotype is a very unique and fundamental attribute for mammalian group as an evolutionary biology feature. That's something we really want to celebrate with further study, okay? And it's more than just major groups. And there is also a decoupling of species diversity versus ecomorphotypes. And if you compare mammals to the non-mammalian vertebrates, and fish actually had highest species count, and the mammals are not even close to birds by species count, but mammals are highly unique. That is, we have a limited number of species, but our ecological diversification, our morphological disparity are extraordinary, okay? Summarized by Jackie Lohmann's PhD thesis with a nice figure. And each of these ecomorphotypes can be largely mapped into phylogenetic tree deeper in the evolutionary history as a repeated evolutionary experiment. For example, we have recurrent locomotor convergences in carnivores, in rodents. They can be, by feeding adaptation, different between light and day and night, but they can achieve the same locomotor patterns. And there are such a very interesting combination, like every tongue feeder mammal would inevitably have some highly specialized adaptation for terrestrial locomotion and digging. But there are caveats. Okay, the caveats is these ecomorphotypes are all on a continuum, and they are very difficult to characterize, especially in field live observation behaviors. And then all these major extant mammal-based predictor for ecological pattern in the history have a general issue about how reliable are your osteological predictors. Okay, and Nations et al. Had a very nice summary and a review about the different ranks about the various strengths of the predictors. The other bigger problem is as the phylogenetic distance goes on, as the convergences are always incomplete, and so further you stretch back in the fossil record to try some comparison, less reliable it would turn out to be. Okay, as Jackie and Ken published a paper fairly recently to summarize this general pattern. But we're paleontologists. You know, we deal the fossil that happened to be discovered, right? And so we move on and try our best. Okay, one of the foundational approach that really started this general approach is from Blair Van Valkenburg, now at UCLA. And she actually started when she was a graduate student. And that is to take into individual locomotor traits or feeding adaptation traits and do the multivariate analysis and use that as an ecomorpho space in which to project your fossil if the fossil and the extant taxon happen to have same morphological traits, right? And this general approach has now been expanded to exploit very many topics. And for example, Cooper and Stephan, I believe Stephan was one of the PhD student maybe 30 years back here in this museum, and Nations and Martin Serra and Roger Benson, Weaver and Grossnickel, all the way up to the Pivesner study, we all use the same general approach. multivariate analysis on linear metrics of the skeletal structure to estimate ecomorphotype and to compare ecomorphotype of the extant mammal with fossils. Okay. One of the more interesting and bold move, we've been talking about this for 10, 15 years. And finally, Chen Meng and Gregory Wilson made the move and essentially summarized all of the early Cretaceous mammal preserved with fossil skeleton from northeastern China, and use the same multivariate analysis and take a gap and see whether or not we can infer their locomotor pattern. For example, there's a very large triconodon called Rapana mammals, is clearly a terrestrial mammal. And there's Achetolistes with very peculiar body proportion and turns out to be, according to the prediction of extant mammal, likely to be semi-fossorial. And the Yanoconodon perhaps is terrestrial. And the Zhanghe is a scansorial, possibly even is arboreal. And Eomaya, one of the early known Cretaceous eutherian, is definitely arboreal now. Okay, and since then, David Grossnick further expanded this with several collaborators. And so now this data set is more than 135 extant species, cover some 30 different limb proportion linear measurements or indices. And it's expanded to encapsulate the entire Jurassic and the Cretaceous mammal that's represented by skeletal features. The reason we're interested in this is this, okay? And we understand modern mammals are diverse. You know, we have semi-aquatic swimmers, we have terrestrial ambulatory carnivores, scavengers, we have fossorial mammal good with tongue feeding, we have lots of tree-living mammals, and we have many gliders. But the good old concept for the lack of a good fossil record from way back is these are all evolved in Cenozoic. That's true, okay? And we compare the extant Cenozoic mammal to that of Mesozoic mammal because the Mesozoic mammal lived in the time of dinosaurs. They failed to diversify in the Mesozoic terrestrial ecosystem because they are somehow completely excluded by dinosaurs, right? And this discussion has went on when early on there were discrepancy about early molecular time estimate versus the available fossil to corroborate. Quite a few people invoked the general discussion that perhaps the cladogenesis represented by molecular phylogeny is not represented by evolutionary morphology as we see in the fossil, so-called decoupling of ecological diversification for phyletic splits. So that ecological diversification is a topic, but that was then. That was then we did not have very many good fossil skeletons preserved. But what is now is, since 2000, 2006, we had a whole series of study of discovery and also reinterpretation of skeletal features. We have quite a few semi-aquatic forms, okay? And we also had fairly large Mesozoic mammalia forms that's definitely capable of carnivore, more than eating just small insects. And perhaps more striking is there are several superb diggers that also have this highly specialized dentition that fit the stereotype of extant tongue feeder associated with digging. And then we have a whole bunch of arboreal mammal, more than you can count with both your hands plus your feet. Okay? And then we have discovered the gliding. And this is what's known up to about 2005, 2007, okay? But what I want to present is the newest information we have is the Jurassic diversification is actually also quite distinct from early Cretaceous diversification. And early Cretaceous diversification, of course, is all happening in extinct mammals. And so this gave us a very interesting discussion about iterative paleoecological evolution. Again, we come back to this general diagram, okay? And the Jurassic diversification happens in an entirely different time frame. And the general actors in that theater are from different phylogenetic clades from early Cretaceous mammal. And that's my general theme. For the Field Museum local pride, I want to feature the Brachiosaurus and the T-Rex. In reality, what happens in early Cretaceous is closer to us than the Cretaceous dinosaurs is from the Brachiosaurus. So the stuff, the evolutionary pattern that I'm portraying here are really ancient history. And they are from these two major rock formations in China. The top is the famous Yixian Formation, and the bottom is Tiaojisan Formation, and there are very good radiometric dates. And the Yixian and associated Jiufotang Formation is about 10 million years from 122 up to about 100. Okay, and the Tiaojisan Formation is about 10 million. It goes roughly from 168 million in the middle Jurassic and it goes to the boundary of middle to late Jurassic to 160 million. The Yixian Formation got its cornucopia of fossil mammals. So we have this multituberculates, we have the splachothoroids called symmetrodons, and then we have the spectacular diversity of triconodons, okay? And the Yixian Formation is also known for not just 1, 2, 3, 4, and there are at least, I would say about 10 different species. Some of it have not been even published from the crown therians, and these are all very well preserved, okay? So if we map this fossil record on evolutionary tree put in a time frame of geological history, we have Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, okay? And if we map the first group that's represented by Yixian Formation, is all this arboreal mammals. There are crown therians, and it's totally unmistakable by their limb proportion, by their fingers, and they are definitely tree-living mammals, okay? And we have lots of osteological feature to go with it on ankles and the wrist as well. So crown therian from Yixian Formation are definitely fully arboreal, and many, many of them, okay? The next major group, if we move on this evolutionary survey to the Symmetrodon, they are diverse as well, okay? And you can tell that the body proportion of this Achilolystis is very strange. Tiny little tail, enormous head and forelimb. And by osteological correlates, this is a fossorial. And whereas Zhanghetherian, Maltherian, quite a few number of those are likely to be arboreal mammals, diverse. Diversity, ecological morphotypes are what I'm emphasizing within each of these clades, okay? And then we have almost like a dozen multituberculates. Not all of them are fully described, but they span a full spectrum of ecomorphotype from tree dwellers to scansorial to terrestrial, okay? And then we have this triconodon mammal, and the most famous of which described by Hu Yaoming et al. Has swallowed a dinosaur in his stomach, whereas the other are tiny and they show very different body proportions even within that size range, okay? But regardless of their ecomorphotype, they all share a very common feature that's fundamental to locomotor pattern, and that is they have this mobile clavicle with a mobile joint between the clavicle and the sternum, and the clavicle with scapula essentially the very familiar theory and mammal pattern that you can move your arm, thereby facilitating very diverse locomotor pattern. It's all coming from this very simple and effective structure of your shoulder. Okay. Again, more than individual features, we map the morphometrics of all these Yixian mammals or early Cretaceous mammal from Eastern Asia. They have a spattering of diversity of ecomorphotypes left and right. Okay, but it's more than just individual, more than just a wholesale mapping of morphometrics. And we also have individual features. I'm going to single out one feature to exemplify how we generally approach this. Okay, here is the diversity of didelphids in South America. They are diverse with many tree-living forms, some terrestrial forms, and some terrestrial form is getting good enough and is also a semi-aquatic, so-called water opossum. Because of the contact with substrate, their finger proportion is quite different. And it is by mapping the finger proportion that maps metacarpal, proximal phalanx, intermediate phalanx, possibly also distal phalanx shape, and we can draw significant information from it. All right. So if we plot the extent of didelphids and the primates hand into this ternary diagram, it's a semblance of the ecomorpho space. We can clearly discriminate between the terrestrial didelphids versus the rest of the arboreal marsupials. And if we also have hands very well preserved in the fossil, and we can give it a try to estimate what are their general functional adaptation and the ecological niche. It turns out for Yixian mammals, the stem fossils are generally terrestrial. Some are capable of scansorial adaptation, but the fully arboreal mammal with extant primates and tree-living marsupial-like hands, they're mostly chronthiris. So phylogenetic transition is associated with ecological difference, at least in that local fauna assemblage. And that general approach has been now expanded to also include the hind limb. And so I'm going to revisit this when we come a little bit later. Okay, so this is what we know about the early Cretaceous. So early Cretaceous, we have some generalized mammal, we have some carnivore that's very heavy and that moves on the ground. And then we have some semi-aquatic forms, and we also have lots of tree-living forms. And that's the Cretaceous, okay? And that's from the early Cretaceous, the Yixian Formation, perhaps also the adjacent Jiufortang Formation. But what I want to do is now to shift the gear to see what's happening in Jurassic. Okay, and Jurassic fossils are well represented from this Taojisan Formation, another Lagerstadt yielding probably more than 200 skeletons now, many of which are scattered, have not been fully studied, but ready to be exploited. And what first come out of Taojisan Formation are some very exotic mammals by morphologies. Okay, and the very first fossil that's recently described from the major sites in Taojisan Formation was Megaconus and Senso, and you can tell that by their limb proportions, and they are very distinct, despite the fact they're all part of the Haramaya clades. Okay, and if you look at Taojisan Formation a little bit further, you realize the Taojisan Formation is completely run over by the species from this very specialized group called Docodons. And we have many fossils of Docodons from the Taojisan Formation. And Taojisan Formation also have some multituberculates, more than one, but only one have been described. but perhaps the most unique fossils from the Taojisan Formation are the Haramiyas. Okay, and by body proportion, you can tell that this is entirely different from some body proportion like that. And some of these are preserved with skin membrane between the limbs, so they are clearly flayers. Okay, so what can we read into this enormous morphological disparity from the fossil that's from the Taojisan Formation? That is a question that I'm asked. Okay, let's review the Dokodang first. Okay, if we look at the Dokodang, the first intuitive impression we have often is their teeth are incredibly complex. They are a different league, more complex than the other mammalian form from late Triassic. Okay, and the Dogodangs definitely have their own ecological specializations. For example, from the Stogophasa, we have a very broad scaly tail. We have transverse H-shaped caudal vertebra, and we have a forelimb capable of digging, which in monotrim actually also used for swimming. And we got the fish-eating teeth. And so they are semi-aquatic mammals, okay? But in addition to being one form, semi-aquatic, we also have tree-living mammals. We name as Agilodocodon. You can tell from the fingers, and that kind of finger is a branch-walking finger, right? A tiny little fossil. And then we have other, even more exotic, disparate fossil form. So like Fruitifossor, look at that terrible claw. And that's a hell of a digger, okay? Now, when we map this diversity of traits, both from dentition and from the hand, we realize that this Dokodang mammal or mammalia forms actually representing a whole wide range of ecomorphotypes. Just mapping, so like Agilodocodon is close in finger proportion to lemur, whereas the Dogophasa is close to Chrysochloris, the African golden moles, right? And they have very different ecological niches. And this formation also generated, the Taojisan Formation also generated some evolutionary very interesting fossils such as pseudo-tribosphenic mammals, but that's another story. But what has really puzzled us is some other form from the Taojisan Formation, such as the Volaticotherium, that has a very interesting recurved teeth. And it's also associated with skin membrane and interpreted to be a glider. So ecologically, very, very distinct. If we look at the fossil we discussed so far, and they largely represent this analogs to Cenozoic mammal with terrestrial, with semi-aquatic, with fossorial, and with a whole bunch of tree-living forms. Okay. Now let's review the other major group from the Taojisan Formation, and that's called the Haramiyas. And those Haramiyas got this incredibly complex teeth. And in fact, there are no perfect extant analog if you really compare bone-to-bone shape or difference of this Taojisan Formation fossils. However, if you make an analogy or a qualitative comparison in jaw shape of this Haramiyas, they are like a Dalbentonia. Dalbentonia is a hell of an outlier for extant mammals, and the crown profile, tooth row profile are analogous to some of the frugivore bats. Frugivore bats are not the most common type of bats. They themselves represent a divergence from the majority of other bats who are insectivores, right? Okay, and the comparison is never perfect, but you get a sense of it. Here is the basing of a Haramiyid, and here is the basing of a frugivore bat. Okay, so you get the sense that dentally they're extremely disparate. Okay, And they are also disparate by finger proportions and the lengths. You can tell that this is the incredibly long tail, very long limb, tiny little head, and their hands are so exaggerated. Their proportion is more disparate than even extant bats compared to non-chiropteran mammals. Well, and the most recent progress about this study of this group is the discovery of association of skin membranes with this very interesting limb proportions, and are clearly gliders, right? Okay, and there are more than one taxon, and I think there are more than 15 or 20 different fossils from it now, and there can be different species depending on how we resolve the dental morphology. But the very interesting discussion is this, okay? So David Grossnickel and I asked a question, yes, this skin membrane association with the skeleton is strongest possible evidence to infer it is glider. But what if we remove the skin membrane, which is a rare preservation, pretend that we never know any of the membrane? Do we still infer these fossils as gliders? Surely we do. Okay, so these red dots are the location of all these hermaids, and this is a plot of all the limb proportional measurements, and you can tell that in some of the metrics, all of these tree-living taxon of hermaids are tree-living taxon by morphometrics, and some of them fall onto the borderline of gliding and arboreal. And if you go by slightly different iterant of morphometric analysis, some of these hermaids gliders without evidence of skin membrane, they are also gliders. So if we strip away the soft tissue preservation, we can still corroborate that are gliders. And we have further evidence of linear measurements of limb proportion, which is very crucial for the gliding inference and the discriminate of glider from arboreal non-gliding. Okay, so if we take this evidence together to see what else is very interesting about this mammal, it turns out they have fixed shoulder girdles. And fixed shoulder girdle very different from clavicular shoulder girdle of Therian mammal, and that's one of the most interesting features about all this hermaids. For example, we actually CT scanned and extracted a couple of fossils, and if we flip it on this, you can see the clavicle actually meet at the midline. And if you really go for more detailed work, you realize there is an impression of interclavicle behind it. And this general pattern of the shoulder girdle is more similar to the bona fide T-shaped interclavicle with two robust clavicle morphotype of mammalia form than with anything else. In modern mammals, this is very well represented in all the monotremes, but the extant monotremes are either powerful diggers or digging mammal associated with swimming adaptation. This definitely extends the ecological range of this type of shoulder girdle for functional specialization. Okay, and I want to really put on the record, one of the early interpretation by B et al., a competing team, reconstructed this clavicle as mobile. Actually, it's not quite correct. And we went to the same fossil, and we can clearly recognize the clavicles are much longer, and that there is an interclavicle impression. And so it's by and large, as we documented in a CT scan, and this clavicle actually are joined in the midline. And that is a sign it's not mobile at all, okay? So what this means is when the shoulder girdle is still in this very strong, robust build with a T-shaped or triangular interclavicle with the two clavicle in the midline, is a fixed feature of this mammalia form before it transformed into mobile clavicle. But despite that limitation of the shoulder, and some of the fossil already developed the tree climbing hands and the feet, and with skin membrane associated with it, fully indicating it's capable of gliding, right? And so what does this mean in the broader evolutionary pattern? And that is for the Herramiids, we have land forms, terrestrials, and we have a whole bunch of tree living form, and quite a few of the tree living form also got the proportion for gliding associated with gliding membrane, so on and so forth. So they are ecologically very divergent. If you combine the Herramiids evidence from those of Docodons, you got quite a bit ecomorphotypes that's highly distinctive, so much so that they are even more disparate and diverse than your Paleocene mammals. And this happened in Mesozoic, and this happened in such a pattern and so early in Jurassic. And by the time Cretaceous come around, very few of these form are around. And they are completely replaced by another a set of crown clades that's equally diverse. And so evolutionary diversification in this ecological morphotypes happened once in Triassic, Jurassic, and then happened one more time in early Cretaceous, and both gone extinct. By the time Cenozoic come along, you got entirely same range of ecological diversity, but made up by different mammals, different clades. So to drive this general discussion home, and that is within the fixed shoulder stem mammal, we have this very wide spattering of diversity. And then many of this declined by the time we get into early Cretaceous, and early Cretaceous got their own taxon. Depends on how we place Volaticotherium. And if we look at another more deterministic feature that help us with this kind of inference, if we are the Cretaceous mammal, the fossil that made up this kind of adaptation, distinctive from this kind of adaptation, are mostly Crontherian with flexible shoulder joint. Whereas if we move to Triassic, this kind of adaptation and this kind of adaptation are still there, but they're from different phylogenetic clades, right? Okay, so let's recap what we understand. Okay, essentially all the red labeled ecomorphotype are what we now know from Jurassic, Cretaceous, or both. Okay, and this fossil also span a fair amount of size range. And if we use the Pleistocene distribution of body mass of the mammals as a yardstick, Megaconus from Jurassic is 250 grams, and they are above the peak. Okay, Aboroharamia is 400 grams, Castorocota is up to 700 grams, and Rapanomammals is 10 kg. And essentially, it's not just happening in small mammal size, it's also happening in fairly large body size, above the average of 200 gram premium for extant crown mammal diversity. Okay, but we still have not found powered flyers. We still have no graviportal early mammals. We still don't have fully aquatic. And these are in the range of terrestrial dinosaurs. And for aquatic, it's dominated by Sauropterygians. And for power flyers, it's dominated by pterosaurs. So we do not have those dominant large body form yet. Okay. So to summarize what we discussed today, and foremost, we have repetitive and the convergent evolution of locomotor modes in early mammals, okay? And this same ecological niche as exemplified by mammalian fossil assemblage is actually made and remade by different clades. So we have two hypotheses, and that is there is clearly a reassembly of convergent mammalian communities, and this convergent mammalian community evolved in such a fashion, there is a faunal succession as we characterize it in classic language, right? So where do we stand with regard to the contingencies, totally unpredictable emergent feature of macroevolution versus this repeatable cycle of evolution from which you can really offer some deterministic interpretation. So that contingency really comes from which mammal clades happen to be involved. But if they are allowed enough of time, they are going to repeat this iterative evolutionary pattern until the Cenozoic. All right. So that is my talk, and I'm open the floor for your discussion. Thank you. Yes, Bruno in the back. Okay, we'll come back. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, super cool talk. So like I'd like to ask the flip side. So if those ecomorphotypes were repeatedly re-evolving, it means they also repeatedly got extinct, right? So what are the mammals that survive all those waves of extinction and then originate the ecomorphotypes? So what are the other ecomorphotypes? Is there any ecomorphotype that's less prone to extinction and then just originates all of those other classes repeatedly?
That's a great question. Let me repeat it for online folks. And Bruno's question is really, are the ecomorphotype gone extinct? Let me repeat it in a different way. Okay, and we have this succession of ecomorphotypes, and many of the ecomorphotypes from earlier clades living in earlier time went extinct. But there got to be some ecomorphotype that would survive and continue to re-diversify, right? What are these? Okay, that's a black box that I do not know. And the current consensus is really generally it's small, generalized body form. And Ken is also interested in the same research, and it's likely to be small and mid-sized faunivorous that tend to survive and readapt and then diversify. There are some very tempting hypothesis, like if you happen to be a fossorial mammal, you may have a better chance to survive. There are other suggestions that for mammals, a boreal mammal definitely confer adaptive advantage as they tend to have longer longevity, okay, and to avoid predation, so on and so forth. I think it is on case-by-case basis if we review extant mammals, but for fossil, we basically do not know. We just characterize the broadest possible pattern to recognize it first. Somebody raised a question here, right?
Yes, I was wondering, you mentioned with your clavicle discussion that you're seeing clavicles that don't necessarily match the ecomorphotype of climbing or gliding animals. Do you have to adjust your kind of analysis of those different principal components to, as you go back in time, to deal with the fact that animal bodies are changing and new innovations are happening in animals?
Well, the question is, I want to repeat for the online audience, and that is whether or not we use the same multivariate morphospace for the fixed clavicles versus the more mobile clavicles, right? The gist of the question is that, yes, we use the same mobile morpho space. We use the same comparative metric data. The difference is really that we perhaps made too much of the interclavicals contribution to overall dexterity of the foramen. What really has come to the surface now is really the evolutionary homoplasy or lability or lack of integration is far stronger when you go distal. And whereas the proximal elements tend to be more conserved, okay? And so it's really a falsification about earlier assumption from the Da Vinci diagram that you gotta have this mobile clavicle in order to achieve a much wider range. The new evidence basically suggests even you fix the interclavicle and the clavicle, you can still do a great deal with the distal portion of your dexterity. Yeah.
So with the Heromyids, those teeth are crazy.
Yeah.
Do they have the same degree of morphological and potentially dietary variation that you see in multituberculates? Since there's multituberculates that are kind of across the board in terms of, I think about surface complexity. Is that a study that's been done on Heromyids because they have such diversity in postcrania?
Yeah. So let me repeat the question. And for the Heromyids, they have highly specialized teeth, and their complexity is basically an order of magnitude on their own. Whether or not they're comparable to those of multituberculates with another Mesozoic mammal group, and or what else is going on with this kind of complex teeth adaptation. I want to reframe a little bit in the broader ecological interaction. When the Heromyids are teeth in Middle Jurassic, there are not any angiosperm plants, whereas it's clearly the case with multituberculates when multituberculates peaked in late Cretaceous, and that's when the first great diversification of angiosperm happened. Whether or not the angiosperm stem lineage or lineage goes back to Jurassic is a forever debate topic. We don't know. Okay, but broadly speaking, it's safe to claim in Middle Jurassic, angiosperm, maybe their lineage existed, but they're not a huge ecological player in any of the four. Okay, so the Heromyids kind of soft plant feeding adaptation with the basin and complex bond kind of a teeth is adapted to different kind of plants. And the same conversation now also goes on with insects. For Jewish soft tissue feeding insects, they're feeding on something soft, but they're not feeding necessarily on angiosperm. So the ecological context is quite different. So the extrapolation is the mammalian assemblage difference is essentially one facet of the broader biotic or ecosystem difference. There's another separate discussion, and that is whether the complexity of Heromyids teeth and the complexity of multituberculate teeth are comparable. That has not been done yet. You know, if you are interested in the research, and then we can use the 3D STL file and give it a try. Yes, Pia.
Yeah, I have a question about, you were talking about how this clavicle doesn't seem to be like a constraint in mammals evolving all these different forms. Does that mean that maybe with more field work you could find fossils in the Triassic maybe that are like more diverse? Or is it something in the anatomy and beyond the mammalia forms that we are starting to see this diversity?
Yeah, so PM's discussion is there is clearly a limb diversity in the mammalia form that have constrained shoulder girdle. And since many of the non-mammalian forms, cynodonts, also have this fixed shoulder, whether or not there are possibility for further fieldwork to discover even in a more distant ancestor from mammalian form, you would have the same limb diversity, right?
Right.
So that's the gist of your question. The funny fact is this Jurassic skeletal fossil preservation from Lagerstadt of Yixian and also from the Tiaojisan Formation are so unique. Okay, and I would not exclude the possibility that for some cynodonts or therapsids to be highly unique, right? And we do have a fantastic example by Frobish and Rice that the Suminia and which is anomodonts, they got the finger proportions that are just like extant tree clams. And if we have that kind of fossil, we can potentially figure out whether the therapsids or cynodonts also had same kind of disparification on their limb skeleton, thereby gave us that ecological inference.
So
Yes.
we've got about, well, it's almost 1:10. So
All right.
maybe, I don't know if there were Zoom questions or if there.
I cannot see it. Can somebody monitor this?
Oh, we don't have any. Oh, never mind. Okay.
Oh, we have one last question.
Thank
Yes.
you. So you talked a lot about ecomorphs.
Yeah.
And that brought to mind like things like ichthyosaur dolphin convergence. Are there any niches that reptiles can't fill that mammals can, or vice versa?
That's a great question. Yeah, so the ecomorphotype convergence or re-evolution or iterative evolution of the same ecomorphotype. Can we go across the major clades, say from reptile to mammal? And ichthyosaur is one, and then you can stretch your analogy to say that pterosaur may be analogous to bats, but all the convergences are imperfect and incomplete. It depends on how far you're willing to stretch that conceptual boundary, and yes or no. If you are very strict, ichthyosaur is not quite identical to dolphins. So it depends on, it's a philosophical question. I got a sliding scale answer of all sorts, and that's what I'm giving. All right, thank you so much.